Hello, and welcome to Mayor Brown's podcast series, Credibly Challenged. This podcast focuses on risk management issues for financial institutions of all sizes, particularly those in the banking sector. My name is Matt Bisanz, and I'm a partner in Mayor Brown's Financial Services Regulatory and Enforcement Practice. Joining me today is Nick Baxter, Chief Risk Officer of the First National Bank of Omaha. On today's program, we will be talking about risk management at a large family-owned banking organization and some of the unique experiences Nick has had over his long tenure with the organization. Thanks again, Nick, for joining us.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Let's go back to the beginning. How did you originally become involved in risk management?
So I'm an attorney by training. I'm actually the fourth generation attorney in my family. And after spending 2 years in private practice, decided that fixing the same problem over and over again was an exercise in futility. So at that point, left for a career in business. I spent a little time in the equestrian equipment business. I made saddles and bridles and sold saddles and bridles, and then ended up at the First National Bank of Omaha in risk management for our merchant acquiring business. And, I was fortunate. I think my legal training and business experience seemed to gel. And I realized that, risk management was where I felt most comfortable. Many, many years later, I'm sitting having dinner with my dad, and we were comparing notes of careers. And it became very similar that his role as outside lawyer to a bunch of family-owned businesses, and what I was doing as a risk manager for a similar business was very, very similar. So I thought that worked out pretty well. So that's kind of how I got involved. It was somewhat serendipitous.
And having had an illustrious career, is that a path that you would recommend for others? What way do you see people starting out in risk management today?
I think a lot of the people that we have in our risk organization started somewhere else. There are very, very few of them. And frankly, that's because we have very few entry-level positions in the organization. We got a lot of people out of branch banking who come into risk, come in out of legal or compliance, in the risk areas. I don't think it's necessary. Actually, I would tell you that in many cases, I think to be a manager in a risk organization, it really helps if you've had accountabilities in other parts of the bank. So many times, you can fall easily into that conundrum or that situation that says, our job is to mitigate risk totally. The reality is the role is called risk management, and that basically says you need to have some risk. And I think having had revenue experience or revenue accountabilities really helps you put what you're doing into perspective. So I said, my way was great, but at the end of the day, I had revenue accountabilities before I came into the risk area. I had revenue accountabilities during my career, and I think that really helps you put the whole thing into perspective.
Yeah, that is a good way to remember what we are here for, that even if we are legal advisors or risk managers, that there is a business and it needs to make a profit for its owners. It needs to keep going on in its operations. And while we may have a focus for our function, keeping track of the bigger picture, that's really important. So.
Yeah, for most of us, the opportunity to, at the end of the day, the business has got to be successful for us to have a job. And I think when you're dealing with salespeople or deal with everybody else, remembering that the business is there to drive bottom line profits in most cases, and stopping those guys working is a pretty good way to see yourself working yourself out of a job.
Mm-hmm. So one topic that I was thinking of when we were prepping for this was about how being at such a long-standing bank like yours that has such a history to it, that it has one way of doing business. And there are newer companies, fintechs come to mind, who maybe are willing to take on more risks. They might try to be more nimble or move more quickly, maybe sometimes break things. When you are confronted with that type of a competitor, how do you help the bank remain competitive?
I think the point is we've been doing business for 160, 170 years. And we haven't been successful over those 170 years by doing things the same way. You know, we could, when we look back at our history, which we tend to do frequently, we see the massive shifts and changes that have occurred in the way that we do business. And I think that's the key. It's in risk management, in any other ways we run the business, it's being open to a better way to accomplish the goals. You know, I think we agree that I think the agile world calls it jobs to be done. You know, that the jobs to be done remain consistent. The way that you get those jobs done consistently changes. And the fintechs, I think, are trying to be successful and are being successful because they're challenging the way that we get those jobs done. So for me, it's a question about saying we have to be open to change. We bring value to the relationship, but it has to be value that's perceived by both sides. So it's really, for me, is when we engage the fintechs, and it's really being open as to this is what we're bringing to the table. We think it has value. We have a common goal. How do we solve for that value? And you know what? Can you make us better in doing the things that we do that you've brought a different view to? And then how do we transition to adopt those? So I do think that the essence of how we operate as risk managers in a legacy business when we're dealing with the fintechs is an openness to the fact that thinking differently brings value to the equation. I have peers that believe that the way we've done it is the way we always need to do it, and frankly, I think that's a short-sighted view. We've got to sit there and say, okay, just because you're thinking differently, where's the value for us? I think that's why actually we have a lot of fintech relationships. I think that's really a lot of the value that we bring, because we are willing to look at things differently.
It's good. Well, one person who often looks at things differently, I won't say person, but one group that looks at things differently is regulators. And when regulators come in, they often will have a radically different view of the bank's business than a bank has of its own business. And that can lead to some difficult conversations, some education on both sides of the equation. And also it can lead to trends over time as regulators say, well, this is what really matters to us. We want to see more of this. We know you did it. What you did 10, 100 years ago, that was good, but our expectations are shifting. And so what in risk management, as you see those regulatory expectations shift over time, how are you working with the regulators? How are you minimizing surprises and maintaining that relationship?
So one of my key accountabilities, and it's different with different companies, one of my key accountabilities is maintaining our relationships, a positive relationship with our regulators. And so my mantra has always been no surprises. It's unfair to expect a regulator to listen to what you've got to say and give you a fair audience if you keep on surprising them. So I think that's the first point. The second point is you have to have perspective. There's very little upside to being a regulator. At the end of the day, think about it. What you're trying to do is you're trying to avoid something bad happen to the financial services sector. When things go really well, you don't get an attaboy. You only get an attaboy when when you fix something that's bad. So I think it's critically important to look at the situation from the regulator's perspective. So that to me is one of the keys, is making sure that I explain to my peers the regulator's perspective of the situation, and then engaging with that regulator to ensure that we've got that right. And that's really what we do. We spend a lot of time, and we're regulated by the control of the currency and the Federal Reserve, and we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that we understand where they're coming from and what their hot buttons are. And that's that can change massively month by month, quarter by quarter, year by year. And so it's not to expect that it stays the same is unrealistic. But at the same time is to make sure that we understand how that relates to what we're trying to do.
Hmm.
For us, it's a consistent balance trying to understand how much information they need to do their job and balancing how much information they need versus our ability to be agile and quickly moving in the business space. And you can't get that if you're only talking to the regulator once every month or once every 2 months.
Hmm.
We've been fortunate that we've had, I've worked with multiple examiners and charges over the year, and what works is engaging them so that there is a commonality of understanding of people's vested interests. What do they need? What do we need? And we have to be honest, and transparent about it. And I think that's the key. The other point, I think, is this issue about regulators always wanting information. We have an obligation to give them that information, but at the same time, we have to understand why they want that information to make sure that what we're giving them is both accurate and relevant. And then, sometimes you have to push back, and say, look, we understand why you want this information. It's going to take us time to get you accurate information. Asking for it for tomorrow or next week is unrealistic. I can get it to you in 10 days or 2 weeks. You can't do that unless you have a relationship with that regulator that understands. So that's at least the rationale as to why you do what you do.
Hmm. Interesting. And when you were talking there about the communication, the building, the relationship, it sounds like you and your regulators, to their credit, put a lot of time into that relationship, and probably given the importance of the risk function, they spend a lot of time talking with you about it, and they're able to dedicate not just the uppermost levels of the regulator, the examiner in charge, but all of the levels of the regulator staff are probably engaged on these issues. What that makes me think of, though, is when you have to pivot and think of doing business in a different way, and that comes up sometimes, I think, when dealing with maybe your board of directors or senior management, where there's limitations on the ability to focus. They can't really push things down to say, well, can someone else take this report and analyze it? That the board is expected to be engaged on these issues. So how do you tailor or change your communication style to maintain a similarly strong relationship with the bank's board?
There is a commonality, and it's called trust. And I think that if you build up a level of trust with both the board in the same way that you do with the regulators, it gives you a lot of flexibility. When you work for a family-owned business, the key is to ensure that the people who need the information get the right information at the right time at the right level. And trust that you are giving them the relevant data for them to make the right decisions. And I think that, as a result of that, there is information that the board is not going to get. They're trusting you to make sure that the information you give them is the information they need to see and that it's relevant and actionable. And you can't do that if there isn't trust going both ways. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the key. My modus operandi with our board is relatively simple, is you spend time establishing the relationship. Mm-hmm. And over time, you deliver them that information. Some of it may not be flattering, or it may be bad news, but they trust you and they understand that you're going to give them what they have to get in order to make the decisions they have. So, I think in an organization like ours, you reach a common understanding as to what the board's accountability is. Mm-hmm. And that means, as a CRO, I have conversations with our board members to say, guys, I understand why you're asking that question, but that is an accountability of management and not the board. Mm-hmm. And you don't need that data. On the flip side, guys, this is a topic that you've got an accountability for. The OCC has made it very clear that they expect that you understand what's going on in this space. And so I'm going to give you the information that you need.
Mm-hmm.
And we've had some very frank conversations on both of those topics in areas where they don't want the information, and in areas where they want it, but they shouldn't have it. Mm-hmm. Some of the best conversations that we've had have been where we're describing, well, I want more information about that. And us saying, you know what, guys, I can give you that information, but have you considered the accountability that that creates when you have it? Do you really want to expand your accountability into an area that currently doesn't exist? Mm-hmm. And I think when you have that discussion, you come to an agreement that says, yeah, you're right, I don't want to know that, but I really want to know about this or the other, and so help me there. So that's kind of been the way that I've worked with our boards over time is balancing that out.
That's a great way to think about it, and I might borrow that approach of do you really want the responsibility that comes with knowing that information? It's kind of like out of an old spy movie where the spy would say, well, if I told you that, I'd have to kill you. It's a good way to make it clear what the consequences are of the actions.
Well, it's always, I think the other one actually is the entertaining one I got from lawyer friends, from litigators, who are always harping on is you'll never ask a question you don't know the answer to. Mm-hmm. That is one that I use frequently with the board and how we interact with them. Is that information is power, information is useful, and you want to make sure that you've got the stuff you need, but not the stuff you don't need.
When you are trying to figure out what the stuff is that you need to do your job, to give reports to other people within the organization, to give reports to the board, one topic I hear coming from others in risk is about what is being measured and how you're measuring it, and particularly the debate seems to be quantitative metrics versus qualitative ones, and I've heard of banks putting tremendous effort, tremendous resources in trying to quantify everything, move everything over to a quantitative metric. And sometimes I'll look at them and say, there's no way that can be material. There's no way anything that metric could tell you would be material to the bank. Why are you putting all of this effort into making a quantitative metric? Or maybe in some cases it just is inappropriate, that there is no way to quantify a particular aspect of reputational risk or some part of conduct risk. It just can't be done. What are your thoughts on that way of identifying what information you need, and is it quantitative or qualitative?
I have to say this, I'm as my finance friends will tell you, I'm a qualitative person versus the quantitative. I think it's also a state of maturity in programs. You layer in the qualitative metrics first, understanding that they're directional in nature and there is a level of trust. But at the end of the day, if you've established trust and perspective around your programs, qualitative KPIs or qualitative numbers move you forward. And they're relatively cost effective put in. At that point, then you can look at the quantitative and work out which of them actually add value when you take into account the cost of production. And so the way that what I do is I grow in, we're looking for impact, we're looking for materiality and value. And so we tend to focus first on qualitative, subjective to a certain extent, subjective metrics that we can move people, that help people move in the right direction. And then as and when time comes, we'll add the objective numbers and metrics in there when they make sense. Mm-hmm. But if you put that in perspective as what are we trying to achieve, I think that gives you a really good rationale as to when you spend the time and when you spend the money. Mm-hmm. What are we trying to do? At the end of the day, what we're trying to do is we're trying to allow our institutions to reach its goals within the general risk appetite statement of the organization. And so I always try and bring it back and say, okay, are the quantitative or are the objective expensive metrics going to help us achieve that goal? And are they really going to give us that incremental add for the cost that we're putting into place? So, to me, as I said, they have their place. Mm-hmm. And the more mature your program is, the more objective metrics that you have involved. Mm-hmm. At the time you're going to evolve into situations, but pushing it seems to me an exercise in futility. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of, I try and bring it back to what are we trying to accomplish, and mm-hmm. how do those goals help us?
Right. That's a good perspective, and again, I see you mentioned trust and the trust within the organization as a really important driver of the way you do business, and that led me to another one of the topics we had been talking about in advance is around privacy risk, because you need customers to trust you. Customers clearly trust you guys if you've been around for so many over 100 years, 170 years, that's a high level of trust the customers have. But it's also shifting, it's particularly in privacy, it's easy to lose that customer trust in the institution. Customers, on one hand, want to click through all of the privacy notices as quickly as possible. I know I do it on my phone all the time. But also, if my data is lost, I get really upset with the organization that lost it. How is the privacy risk and the need to maintain that customer trust in the bank? How is that affecting your day to day?
People get annoyed with me on this topic here because my views on privacy are probably a little bit different to a lot of my peers. I think the privacy debate is the Achilles heel of the established financial services industry. I think that we have made a business out of leveraging customer data to drive success, and in doing that, we've produced products that have been incredibly valuable to customers. But the worm's turning. Customers' views on their personal data are changing. It's generational, but also experiential. And customers don't really understand what we're doing with their data. And so I have a little phrase that, I said, look, if we treat customer data the same way we deal with their deposits, we're not going to be far wrong. At the end of the day, the data that a customer gives us about themselves should be treated the same way as the cash deposits they place in the bank. And if you follow that from a principles basis, you're not going to go far wrong. So, my view is that the banks that are able to leverage successfully this changing environment are going to be the banks that are transparent as to the data they've got, transparent as to the way they use that data, and give customers options, informed options, as to how that data is used. So, to me, going out with a preference center that says, hey, you've got the legal right to do X, Y, and Z. Which one do you want? Is pointless. Mm-hmm. You need to go out to a customer and explain their options, but explain the consequences of their options. Mm-hmm. And the banks that do that, I think, are going to be the banks that are long-term successful with changing generations. The law, and I hate to say this, I'm not sure whether I mean it or not, but the law is irrelevant. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, you've got to work out how your customers want you to deal with their data. And then that's where I differ with a lot of my peers who see it as our data. It's not. It's the customer's data. And we need to separate what's the customer's data and what ours is. And ours is the data that we create from the data we're given and the transactions and the transparency, the work we do. That's ours. So I just said, in summary, you treat customer data the way you treat customer deposits. You don't go far wrong, and you ask customers in an informed fashion as to what they want you to do, so that they understand the consequences of their choices. it's a massive, I think it's a massive opportunity for the industry.
Mhm.
And I think that's what will allow us to be successful in the face of a lot of the fintechs and
Yeah.
the reg tech companies.
And I think it ties back to something you said earlier about like we're here to run a business. That's what the bank exists for, and complying with the law, the big L law, that isn't the business of the bank. That's not how it's going to make its money. That the way it makes its money is by making customers happy. That by drawing them in, by building that trust. And so just saying, well, we have complied with the law. That isn't really a compelling business model, at least to me. That saying not only have we complied with the law, but we've created this innovative, this respectful way to meet your expectations. That sounds like a better business case, at least to me as a humble lawyer over here.
The essence of the value of our brand isn't the legal charter that licenses us to run the business. It's the trust that that brand creates in the mind of our customers. At the end of the day, we got started as banks because someone wanted somewhere to safely put their assets of value.
Mm-hmm.
In reality, those assets of value change over time, but the trust and the expectation of trust doesn't. Mm-hmm. Which is why I come back to my deposits analogy. To me, if we want to be successful long term, the essence of privacy regulation and everything else is the customer's giving us something that they value. We have an obligation to protect that and not abuse that trust. It's actually very, very simple. You don't need tens of thousands of pages of law. Mm-hmm. Or regulations or regulatory issuances. Mm-hmm. It's really a question of trust and doing the right thing that goes back to the first banks. Mm-hmm. Who were just taking, at the end of the day, in this country, we trace our history as a bank back to a one-story building in Omaha where we took deposits of gold dust.
Wow.
And I hate to be, but that's how we got started, is somebody trusted us to take those assets and protect them. And I think we should treat the customer data that we have in the same way. Yeah.
You've clearly spent a lot of time thinking not only about risk, but about the business of banking and how it's grown and where it can go. When you do work with lawyers, be they in-house counsel or external counsel who are working with you on risk issues, what's one thing that you wish they did differently or that they knew to help you be more effective?
When I started the bank, we used one law firm for absolutely everything. And it is and was a great relationship, but over time, and what that gave us was that organization had great institutional knowledge. And so you didn't have to spend time. The challenge has occurred over time is that the letterhead wars, especially when you're dealing with regulatory agencies, has come up and has led, the fact is that frankly, sometimes you have to go away from the hometown bank to get specialization, but also to get recognition when you're dealing with regulatory agencies. I don't like it, but it's reality. But I think the cornerstone of the successful legal relationships is the law firms that try to understand your organization, that are very clear trying to understand what the problem is that you're trying to solve, have perspective around it, and then are more than happy to give you relevant, actionable advice that's based on their experience of what's going on in the industry. Mm-hmm. We all have the arrogance of the independent charter that says, oh, we're just different from everywhere else. Mm-hmm. The reality is that the argument of being unique is very, very rare. Mm-hmm. Most of the time, the issue that you're facing has been faced and solved by somebody else. And I think that law firms, have to be able to say, look, guys, I know you think you're unique.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is that we've seen this issue in X number of times, and it's ended up like this. And and frankly, we see your situation as fitting into this bucket. Why do you think you're different? And be able to bring that advice in a way that people are willing to listen. So I think that's the key essence of what we're doing. It's really that ability to analyze, to understand the perspective, and to provide the advice in a way that that can be taken. I think the other part is sometimes outside law firms don't realize the challenge that the person they're dealing with has, is that somebody's got to sell that advice within their organization. You're dealing with the individual in the company who's retained you. In many, many cases, that individual has to sell that course of action to somebody else. And so if you come in realizing that that's the case and say, okay, how can I help you sell this course of action to the actual decision makers? And I think the companies that do that really add value to the occasion, because they can help people get that decision across the finish line.
Yeah, that sounds like a collaborative relationship there of not just giving an answer to the client, but also helping them execute it and helping them build the consensus to execute it.
Yeah, I think the other one that does it over time is that I appreciate this. We have a large in-house legal department. We're a very transactional organization, so we have a lot of people outposted in business units. I don't mind being sold. At the end of the day, I like the relationships that we have with law firms, where that contact partner is actively trying to bring value into the company. The accountants and the CPA firms have done this for years, and it can get very, very irritating. The tax providers have also done it, but the reality is that the more that the engagement partner knows about the business and then tries to bring value-added solutions in, it's I think in most cases it's very well received.
Yeah.
You don't have to go over the line, but that proactive approach to understanding the challenges that the business is facing and then bringing experiential advice in is really perceived well. It helps a great deal. I think that to a certain extent is some of what we lost, where we had just one firm who was doing everything. But I think that you guys are in business, law firms are in business like banks are, and you've got to increase revenue, and you will have targets. The more you can know about the business, and the more solutions that you can bring to make us look good, we appreciate it. We're measured like everybody else, and if we can bring value and new ways to look at things, then it's a win-win for everybody.
I think you've certainly brought some value to this podcast episode that I've learned a lot. I think our listeners have learned a lot. Nick, I want to thank you for participating in the Credibly Challenged podcast. And to our audience, I want to thank you for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed it. And please tune in for next month's edition.